At our house, whenever we're scrolling for a movie on, say, Netflix or Amazon or some other streamer, and I come across a description that mentions moors, I take a closer look. I mean, anything with moors, misty, spooky lands, ancient places of lore and legend, I'm there. Paul Sinclair's film, Wolflands, is a documentary, though, and it has all of that stuff. It has moors and cliffs and ancient forest and ancient legends and curses, shapeshifters, were-creatures, terrifying encounters in the dark, glowing eyes, you name it. Beyond just scaring the pants off of people, though, the beasts that roam Wolflands can do some serious damage and have done so. More on that when we return. Paul Sinclair, I imagine it's one thing to be sitting at home in a well-lit room listening to this and saying, there's no such thing as werewolves or wolfmen or dogmen, anything like that. It's another thing to be out there in the dark forest at night by yourself in the situations that you document in your film. There was a case that you have of a guy, a mountain biker. You'd already told us the story about somebody who was driving out there, and this thing came up on side and ran with the car for a while. This guy's biking. He's on a bike, and something huge and invisible starts running alongside him. Tell us that story.
Yeah, that's correct. This guy's called Sam, and he'd gone on a 28-mile mountain bike ride, George, across the moors, and he ended up coming home. He said he'd left it a little bit late, and he ended up entering the forest, or the heavily wooded area of what's called Langdale End, quite late. He said it was dark. All that you could see was the chalk road in front of him. No fear, because he'd never experienced anything like this before. As most of the witnesses, they've not gone looking for this. In fact, everybody in Wolflands, the phenomena has come to them. So he's familiar with what's out there, as in deer and fox and badger, because that's about the only thing that you're going to encounter in the forests of the United Kingdom and the woodlands. Riding along, it's dark, as I've said, and suddenly something burst out of the woodland I think he said on his left-hand side, and startled him, obviously, and it's heavy, and it's crushing and crashing through the undergrowth at the side of him, and he's looking to his left. He keeps looking, and can't see what this is. He can hear it, and it's very close. And as he says in the documentary, I'm familiar with deer and how they react, and they sort of zigzag about, and they don't parallel somebody on a woodland path or a forest path. He said, and I'm getting more and more anxious. I speed up, and whatever this is speeds up with me. I don't know the exact time span, but in the end, he screams and swears at whatever it is that's pacing him in the forest. And it instantly stops. Doesn't divert and go into the forest. Whatever it does, it stops on a dime. It's just stopped. He carries on cycling, reaches his car. He's got a bike rack on the back of the car, and he's just in blind panic. He said he dropped his keys at one point. He's just that frightened, looking behind him, gets the feeling that whatever it is still watching him, and obviously gets his bike on his car and speeds away into the night. But interestingly, George, Langdale End, it's in the middle of nowhere. It's once again the Forge Valley, very close to all these other locations. Hackness, Broxer Forest, Harwood-Dale, where we've got reports, and where the gamekeeper had his report was about 7 miles away. But interestingly, I spoke to a rock angler of all things, because the coast is not far away. It's only about 6 or 7 miles away as the crow flies. Not even that, probably, in some areas, as the land weaves in and out. But he put me in touch with a guy who lived down Langdale End, because he told this rock angler while they were fishing one day, he believed that there was a bear, of all things, that had been reported in the ravine at Langdale End. And it's common knowledge that walkers, over years, I don't mean like every week, I mean over a period of years, have stopped tractors, ran over to people in fields and said, we've just seen a large animal, we think it was a bear. Now, what's interesting also is that Langdale End leads to that ravine where those three guys got trapped in the night in 2018. So once again, George, location is key.
Isn't there some kind of burial mounds or something there? I think you interviewed this guy next to this main burial mound. Who's buried out there? How old is that?
These mostly Neolithic earthworks, and yeah, that's correct. I mean, I'll jump to those, what you're on about, but we've got another report that's never been talked about near in a nearby forest, and that's near burial mounds called the Three Tremblers. Nobody seems to be able to decipher why it's called, these mounds are called that. But jumping back to that one, yes, they're very close to burial mounds and earthworks, and you've got what's called Wolf Howe, which the Howe is a burial mound or a tumuli. You've got Wolf Howe Low, Wolf Howe High. Just, I suppose these are the elevations of these things. But interestingly, very close to where he had his encounter with this thing that paced him, you've got a place called Moor Rig. Now, I established earlier, if anybody picked up on it, that a rig is an outcrop of stone, a rocky area. But what I found fascinating was the word moor, because it's not just spelled M-O-R-E, it's spelled M-A-R, as in the moor. And it kind of... It has connotations and signifies Norse. There's a huge Norse presence, and when we go to the Norse presence, we think of Fenrir, the Viking hound that was said to have brought about the end of the world in the Viking, what would have been essentially the Viking Bible, Ragnarok, where Fenrir brought about the end of the world.
Yeah, that wolf is the son of Loki, I think, right?
That's correct. So we've got this place there called Moor Rig. The moor is the gaping jaws of a beast, an animal, and we've got Wolf Howe very close to it. And there's another area, probably about half a mile away from Moor Rig, called Warsman's Head. Now, in Norse, the Viking terminology, the warg is a wolf.
That's right out of Lord of the Rings. That's Tolkien stuff, warg, right?
Yeah, so, and you know, Tolkien obviously didn't create these names. He'd done his research and realised that the warg, going back much, much further than Tolkien, is a wolf when we're talking about Viking terminology. So we've only got to swap one letter and Warsman's Head becomes Wolfman's Head.
Wow.
Which is, we know they're only plays on words, George, but it's fascinating. There's so many clues there. And, you know, yeah, Warsman's Head, Moor Rig, everything, the Broxer Forest, all the ingredients for the strangeness seem to be present in these areas.
I want to touch on a real serious harm that has erupted in that area, animal mutilations, and then you take it a step further to look at people that have disappeared and possible human mutilations. Is it related to these creatures, these 7-foot-tall wolf people?
It would be wrong of me to say yes, they are, but equally so, I think they've got to be included in these accounts because these things have happened in the locations that are very close proximity to where the documentary has been made. Just like, and we'll jump to what you've spoke about in a moment, George, just like the missing people of Bempton, which is my main area of research. You know, it would be wrong of me to say that they've gone missing and they're somehow involved in some kind of UFO encounter or alien abduction encounter, because I've no proof of that. But I've documented in the first Truth Proof book, because they've gone missing in highly unusual circumstances in an area where things of a highly unusual nature take place. So, yeah, we've got Langdale Forest, which is very close to Broxer, very close to all these other areas. And back in the 1990s, there was a researcher, I'm not sure if you ever got the chance to speak to him, George, you may have done, called Tony Dodd. He was a retired police... Well, I did a bit of work with Tony on a Lightning that crashed off the north of Bempton, actually, Lightning XS 894 on September the 8th, 1970. I found lots of new information about that Tony didn't know. And we worked together on that. But jumping to this, Tony was researching back in the mid to late 1990s Dalby Forest, where he was looking into reports of strange creatures, strange animals that had been seen. The chupacabra, I think I pronounced that right, have a George, and other things. Animal mutilations. I think they'd found donkeys, they'd found fox, badgers, sheep. Nothing any different to what I've been finding in 2017 to 2019 on and around the cliff tops of Bempton. But more importantly and more macabre was the fact that Tony documented bodies that were found in a certain field in Dalby Forest. Because there are clearings, there are meadows, and the authorities, so I'm informed, told the general public at large that these were mannequins, shop mannequins that had been placed in the field. Over a period, I know, they were finding one at a time. I mean, for my money, who's going to take a shop mannequin deep into a forest and leave it in a field for somebody to find? So that's what Tony was documenting. And what's interesting, if this is true, and I also need to add that I've got more information on this, that it'll probably be something for another documentary, but we've identified the field. I have the name of the field. I've also been told that this area now has to be closed off to the public occasionally. And I don't mean like they close it off with some tape. All access is stopped to the public, because these forests are more. You can walk about them. And obviously not many people stray off the forestry paths because they're very deep. But I've just recently got this new information which I will be chasing up on, and I don't find any what's the word, any excitement in talking about missing people, and because it's not entertainment, George, it's very serious in my eyes, because it's someone's loved one, it's someone's son, husband, wife, or whatever. But I don't think we'd be doing these cases justice if we didn't document them. I think we've just got to be careful that we don't place them or attach them to any part of the phenomena, because we've no proof of that. I think all we can say is these things have happened in areas where other things of high strangeness take place. So, interestingly, Tony's working in these forests, and is working with a witness who he calls Cedar. Now, we think we've identified Cedar now, and we're going back to the 1990s, early 2000s. Cedar may not be with us anymore, let's face it. And I think through the gamekeeper who appears in Wolfland, we've identified Cedar. But what a shame, George, because I know the listeners to your show won't know the extent of the gamekeeper's encounter, but he was working in the forests around an area called Stape and Cropton, which are 7 miles away from where I've just been speaking about, with nothing in between. It's just forest. These places are only separated by names and forest tracks and roads that run through them. And he had no idea, when he had his experience in that forest in Stape, walking back to that abandoned farmhouse, he had no idea at the time that there was an active researcher in Tony Dodd working with people within the neighbouring forests, looking at strange creatures, animal and, as sad as it is to say, human mutilation. So everything was linked. I mean, back in the day, I'm sure that the gamekeeper would have loved to have spoken to him, although he did sit on his encounter. I don't know when he contacted me. I think he contacted me in 2019, and he'd sat on it from 2002. He'd just not spoken about it. And with this guy, it's not a matter of he didn't feel brave enough. This guy is a formidable man. He just, I think, as with anything within the subject of the unexplained, if it's impacted a person, if you've been touched by the abduction phenomena, the only proof you've got of it is ingrained inside your head. If you've seen the cryptid, the only proof you've got is what you've actually digested, what you've taken in through your eyes and your senses. And to try and tell somebody who's never had that experience and then risk being laughed at, it's a hurtful thing, and it's an insulting thing to the individual who's had the experience. And like we've said earlier, and I think lots of people would agree, seeing is believing, but these people have seen things that's off the scale of normal, and it's such a difficult thing. They've got to be treated with respect.
Well, I totally agree with you, and I've been through that same situation. The witnesses that I've interviewed about Skinwalker, the Uinta Basin, Skinwalker Ranch, in and around that area, who've seen what we'd call werewolves and other kinds of creatures that don't make any sense, that are not found in the geologic record, that shouldn't exist, yet they see them over and over. And it's dozens and dozens of people have seen them, and they get scoffed at. They get ridiculed if they come forward and say it. So most of the witnesses, in all likelihood, never tell anyone outside their immediate family about these things. It's like that for you and your witnesses.
It's exactly the same. And, you touched on the name on Skinwalker, and there's places all around the world. I don't mean there's hundreds of them, that are similar and exhibiting this high strangeness. And I think Bempton and some of these forests are no different. And you've got the Hoya Baku forest that sort of seems to exhibit high strangeness and missing people. I noted that you'd got playing some music by a mutual friend, Robbie, earlier, and
yes.
I've spoke to Robbie. I've been fortunate to spend time in his company, and I've spoke to Robbie about these things, and he's fascinated. He's absolutely enthralled by this, and I sent him some footage the other day that I'd cleaned up of lights under the sea off Bempton. You know, I know I'm jumping away from the cryptid, so I do apologise, George, but I spend an unhealthy amount of time in these locations, and I was up there just before midnight on the 15th, so it's not long ago, and with a Psionics camera, I spend a fortune on cameras, a lot more than what the Psionics cost, but that's able to pick up things in low light. So with our eyes, we could see the lights under the sea, myself, a guy called Ian and Peter, and I filmed these lights. I put a bit of grainy footage onto the internet without cleaning it up, and I just put about 10 seconds, but I've since taken it into a program and cleaned 4 minutes up, which it's incredible. We've got lights beneath the surface of the sea. I mean, I don't know what that's telling us. Are we looking at a true USO? And I like to be honest about these things, and I'm sorry for branching away here, George.
No. I was heading to Bempton Cliffs. That's where I was headed next, so good.
Okay, well, I don't want to, I want to be as truthful as I can. These were true unidentifieds, but I'll just jump back a few months. I have a thermal camera, a pulsar thermal camera, which is very good. And I was scanning the sea. There'd been a vessel out there called an unmanned research vessel called the X-20, and I'd been documenting it for months. I don't know what it's doing out there. It's about 15 to 20 foot long, and it must be remotely operated. It's got side scan sonar. It's got all sorts of things on it. And I saw from the light configuration of this vessel, because I'd been watching it for so long, that it was out there. And when I'm scanning with the thermal camera, I can see a huge heat signature alongside of this vessel. And I'm quite excited, I'll be honest with you, because it's clearly below the surface, and if the vessel's 15 to 20 foot long, this is something like 40 to 50 foot. It's a long, glowing tube. And I thought, good God, I'm filming a true USO beneath the surface of the North Sea. Well, a week later, on South Beach in Bridlington, a 45-foot fin whale beached. It was one of two. And so I could have sat on the footage, George. This is what I'm getting at. I could have sat on the footage and put it out there and told a little untruth and said, look what I filmed. Look at this amazing bit of footage of a true one. But I told the truth. I believe I'd filmed the whale. I think that's exactly what I'd filmed. And I went down onto the beach and actually filmed the whale as well on the beach, this unfortunate animal.
Hey, you're an honest guy, Paul Sinclair. You tell the truth. You tell it to the best of your ability. We're talking with Paul Sinclair about his amazing new film, Wolflands. When we come back, we'll find out where you can see this, and then we'll take some calls, questions, comments from our listeners. We have one more segment to go. I'll take your calls, questions, and comments from my guest, Paul Sinclair, who's been filling us in about werewolves, were-creatures, legends, lore, this place that he has dubbed Wolflands, an excellent documentary. I'm going to tell you in a moment how you can find it, but if you've got a question, we'll be right back in our final segment of Coast to Coast AM. Paul Sinclair, you put your heart and soul into making this film. It's Wolflands, 2 words, Wolflands, a title. Where can people find it? How do they watch it?
The film's available, George, on Amazon Prime. And, I'm not trying to... Obviously, we're trying to promote a film, but, I think the film stands on its own merit, and the reviews that we've got so far, read the reviews, form your own opinion. So, it can be found on Amazon Prime. And there will also be a link to it on the Truth Proof website, which is truthproof.uk. And that's the same place that you could obtain the paperbacks of my books. The Kindle versions are on Amazon. And there's 5 books to read as well, which document not just the cryptid phenomena, but UFOs and the full spectrum of unexplained phenomena. And one book called The Night People, which is my own experiences from childhood, which have probably put me on the road I'm on today, and that's why I'm so entrenched in this subject, George. And I will be speaking about the night people at the upcoming Awakening Conference this weekend in Manchester, the Awakening Conscious Life Expo, where there'll be lots of other speakers from overseas as well talking.
Oh,
so,
yeah. I'd love to attend one of those one of these times. I'm going to have to pop over the pond and see what you're up to. So I imagine, based on the treatment, the honorable treatment that you give the witnesses who appear on camera in Wolflands, the first one, it makes it so much easier, hopefully, to produce a follow-up, Wolflands 2, whatever you want to call it, that people will see you treated them with respect and they can trust you, and it would be easier to get them to appear on camera and tell their stories.
You would hope so, George, yeah. I mean, it goes without saying that the people that we've filmed, I haven't had a negative response from anyone, and they're quite happy with what they've seen in the finished product. So hopefully we've opened the door, just like with anything else, just like these incredible congressional hearings that you attended, which benchmark kind of moment, that's opening the door for the phenomena to become more acceptable to the population as a whole. So let's hope that by producing films or documentaries like Wolflands, it helps people feel confident enough to share these accounts, because a lot of things, I think, George, are getting taken to the grave with people, accounts that are absolutely incredible and not just cryptid related, across the full spectrum of unexplained phenomena.
Let's take a call. We've got Ryan in Pearl River, New York on the wildcard line. Hi, Ryan. Welcome to Coast. What's on your mind?
Gentlemen, awesome show, awesome guest. Okay, this reminds me of a great movie with Abbott and Costello, Meet Frankenstein, and Lou Costello gets off one of the greatest lines ever in the history of Hollywood. Lon Chaney Jr. tells Lou Costello, listen, you got to lock me in my hotel room tonight by 12 o'clock. And Costello's looking at him inquisitive, like, he's well, why? He goes, because Lon Chaney Jr. tells him, because at 12 o'clock, I'm going to turn into a werewolf. And Costello tells him, yeah, you and a million other guys. Now, guys, I love this. I'm fascinated by it. I know a lot of people have gone camping. I've done a lot of camping in my life since I was a kid. Every werewolf story I ever hear, or have seen a werewolf, or potentially they saw a werewolf, couldn't be sure because of the bush and everything, always in the woods. Now, always out in the area camping. I wonder if werewolves have a preference. The thing is, if you really want to get the really low down on werewolves, especially in North America, especially up in where there's big wooded areas in this country in America, they have to repeal the 65 Immigration Act. If they repeal that act, finally you'll have people in Congress that will be looking to solve some of these mysteries like werewolves. And we just won't watch them in movies. Very popular with Lon Chaney Jr., like I said, in that movie.
Thank you, Ryan. And for your amusing and interesting question. And just to briefly touch on a few things, obviously you'll probably know this, Ryan, but there's no correlation to phases of the moon or silver bullets with what we're talking about. That's purely reserved for the movies and I don't know, creative writers. What we're dealing with is something that's been here a hell of a long time. And I also need to say that the documentary does not just cover the werewolf, even though it's titled Wolflands, because primarily that's what we have covered, but the gamekeeper's encounter, it could have been almost Bigfoot, Sasquatch type related. I guess we'll never know. But yeah, thank you.
You also have a case where one of these things is seen down by the ocean, right? It's on a cliff. It's not in the woods. From the film?
Yeah, that's correct. And what's interesting about this is the other associated phenomena that's seen with these things. I think you're talking about the guy who went for a walk along. He lived in a small fishing town called Reeton, right on the edge of the coast, and further up, aptly named, is Speeton, and these are where the 400-foot cliffs emerge. And he took his dog down onto the cliffs, down onto the beach, and these cliffs slowly sort of changed in gradient till they become 400 foot. And these are to a part called Black Cliff. Incidentally, it's where there's been a lot of big cat sightings as well. And I think everybody in the UK now and around the world for years we've resisted the idea that these big cats could be here, but I think people know that they're here. But it's just interesting that that's the spot as well. And he described his dog as being quite intuitive, as in it was a pointer dog, a gun dog, and it would stand in a different stance if it saw a rabbit to what it would if it saw a pheasant. And he can't work out what it's looking at. And he gets his binoculars from his breast pocket. But incidentally, I've just talked about the full moon. There was a full moon. And I don't think that's got any kind of relation, but that's what he told me. Full moon in November 2019, I believe it was. And he said, I looked up the side of the cliff, and there's something I believe was a big goat or a donkey. I couldn't tell what it was at first. And then it stood on two legs. He said, it's looking at me. I can see it's silhouetted, no glowing eyes, nothing, no gnashing teeth. It's just a dark silhouette. He said it turned and went along the cliff tops. What I find fascinating about that account, George, is the fact that when I looked up the full moon in November 2019, I believe it was November the 12th. 2 days prior to that, and we'd no knowledge of this story that I've just related, I was on the cliff tops with not filming, apologies, we filmed it for Wolflands, but I was on the cliff tops on the 14th of November 2019 with a guy called Lee Haywood.
Yes.
And Lee's a bit of a skeptic, and he'd come down to explain to me or try and solve what I'd been looking at when we called these lights the intelligent light forms. He believed there would be a rational explanation. And it was, we saw the lights, and we saw a huge sphere of light in the field with us. Now, obviously, I didn't know about the cryptid story till well after that, but when we married them together, we realized that there's 2 days between sightings. And the account that I was told by this man of what he saw, I wasn't alone. He told there was a guy with me, a witness called Bob Brown. He heard the story. And then on a later date, there was a lady with us called Amanda Eames. And Amanda, myself and Bob, I asked him to tell the story to Amanda as well. And just strange, uncanny that we've got light form phenomena and we've got strange bipedal cryptid-type creature seen within the same location, within the same proximity, and within the same time span. Not the same night, but 14th of November, 12th of November. There's not a lot of difference.
You have a case in your film. I had made a note about it. That's why I remember two people named Jamie and Lee. They're walking along. Yeah. They see this huge animal in the darkness. It's sitting on the edge of this cliff. They didn't know what it was until it moved. They had an ominous feeling. It was a big black shadow. Then it stood up. It looked like a really big dog. They had these equipment, an IR camera that they were out there to take some photos. They could see this thing with their eyes, but not on the camera. And when it sat down, they figured it might have been 6 or 7 feet tall. It looked massive, right?
They said it was incredible. They'd gone down into this ravine at Flamborough Head. It's the peninsula, the headland, about 4 miles from where I'm sat now in Bridlington. During the night, they'd come for a weekend, and they'd got a cottage in Flamborough, and they'd walk down to Flamborough Head, the headland, which is pretty remote. It gets tourists there in the daytime. It's a beautiful place, stunning scenery. They stood at the top looking out to sea and entered the ravine, which would be about 70 foot deep, I would think. Earth steps down into it and a little bridge with running water at the bottom. Quirky coincidence, it's called Holmes's Gut. That's what the locals call the ravine. And this lady's surname was Holmes. Just a coincidence, people. And I don't know why I'm rambling on about that, but there you go. So when they're down in the ravine, they note that some geese are flying over the head, and they could hear the geese. And then suddenly, just like the guy on the cliff tops at Scalby Mills, which would be about 10 miles away, suddenly everything went silent. She said it felt uneasy, we felt frightened, and she said she'd sort of tapped Lee in the chest and said, come on, we can do this in daylight. We're not familiar with the area. This don't feel right. And they climbed the steps, and they stood on the top momentarily. And then on one of the nabs, as they call them, the outcrops of rock, looking down into the cove, which would be North Landing Cove, they can see something sat on the very edge of the cliff. And they'd looked there before, and they said they're sure they'd not seen it, but obviously they're not looking for unexplained phenomena as in a cryptid, and they're puzzled. They could be wrong. It could be just a statue or a big rock that they'd just missed. And they're watching it, and Lee's got an assortment of cameras, and he put the IR camera on it, as you've just said, George, and they couldn't see it through the camera. Then Lee said it growled. Jamie didn't hear it, and he heard a grumbling sound or a growl, and this thing slowly lowered down then from being what she estimated to be 7 foot, sat in this position. Huge dog, she said, huge, exaggerated long arms that she can see in its silhouette, and it slinked along the edge of the cliff. And they, obviously, after seeing this, they disappeared down onto the main road and back to their cottage. And they must have done some Googling that exact night, that same night, and I was still up. I don't get much sleep, George. I'll go to bed at 12 and I'll wake up at 5. That's a regular thing for me. And they contacted me. I got an email and they told me what they'd just seen. And I met them the very next morning once again with Bob Brown. And they allowed us to film them on the cliff tops. Jamie came back then at a later date with one of her relatives. And I filmed Jamie separately, and that's what's in the film Wolflands, that interview.
Let's try to get one more call in. Larry in Providence, Rhode Island. Good morning, Larry. You're on with Paul Sinclair.
Great show, guys. Love the werewolves. I wonder the difference between a werewolf.
Hey, we're having trouble hearing you, Larry. Can you put...
The other caller, I know Hollywood takes liberties with the truth and half-truths. But I just want to wonder one thing about werewolves. Like, when I go down to New York City, there's a lot of werewolves down there, but they're not the type that you're describing. So I'm just wondering, what would we do if we captured one of them, or if one of them just walked in and said, they wanted to talk to the media or something? How would we react to that?
Let me help you with that question too, Larry. I think that's a good, interesting point. What are these things, Paul? Are they flesh and blood creatures? There's no geologic record of wolfman, werewolf bones or things of that sort. What the heck are they? Do you have any theories?
Well, conclusions that I've come to, George, are that there's something, they're real. We've got to establish what is the real. There's something that can live between worlds, because it seems like they can slip in and out of our existence at will. It's difficult when, like you've just said, and like Larry's just said, where is the proof of these things? The proof is in the witness testimony, but it's like all aspects of the unexplained phenomena, the UFOs. The subtitle of my first book is The Truth That Leaves No Proof, because the only proof that we've got, George, is what's imprinted in our minds. But these things are here. I'm absolutely certain that they're here. I don't think we're going to get one coming forward. And I know our time is very short now, because I'd actually got a report from some urban reports, and I've got one which I've called the Prestwick Baboon from 1999, which is not in our area, where this thing appeared on a military base, and a young lady saw it who was 18, working at Prestwick, Moncton in Prestwick, Scotland, as an administrator for British Aerospace, because that was in the same compound. And one morning she saw this thing. She heard a noise as she's coming into work. The postman is riding about in what's like a golf buggy in the compound, and she hears a noise and sees this huge dog come out on all fours from a hangar, and she can't work out what she's looking at. And then it stood up and terrified her. What's interesting, and obviously I'm just skimming over the surface of this. This was 1999. The local papers, and these papers will still be able to be found and researched, talked about a huge baboon on the loose, and people were seeing a baboon. She said it was no baboon. She saw it up close and personal on a military base. I think there was a restricted area where HMS Gannet was stationed as well. Separated by fencing and armed guards. There was also Air Sea Rescue based there. So what are these things doing in some instances around military complexes? And that's probably something for another conversation.
Yeah, I've heard some cases like that, Bigfoot-type creatures seen around military bases, nuclear bases, for example. It doesn't make any sense. I got one more thing to raise with you. We've got just 2 minutes left. When you and I first started communicating years ago, it was about weird lights, the Bempton lights, the mysterious lights that you had documented. You go out with this guy, the skeptic guy that you mentioned, for this film, and he's going to explain away these lights, and you two see something really dramatic that is recreated in this film, this huge ball of light that is on this side of a hill, pretty spectacular sighting.
Absolutely, George. And I've gone up there for years and years and said, as I've said, I'll make it as quick as I can. I've got this unhealthy time that I spend up there, and Lee had come up to look, and it's almost like these things performed on cue. And I often say that unexplained phenomena does not perform to order, but look, we were driving along this single-track road. Lee says to me, what do these lights look like? Literally looked out the window, there's a huge orange sphere of light in the sky. I said, like that. He didn't say at the time, but he said, I realised I didn't quite know what I was looking at there. He knew exactly what military aircraft should have been in the sky. He could tell you the names of the boats out at sea. So over the period then, George, of about, 3 or 4 hours, we documented these lights out at sea. And I've got a camera, a Sony NX80, aimed at these things, trying to film them. And they just appear, they just punch into existence. But I turned round to look at Lee, speak to him, and there's a huge sphere of light, and in Lee's words, the influence that the light gave off was as big as a Volkswagen Beetle, and it's in the field with us. And as I'm pulling the camera around, it's imploding and dissipating, and it's gone. And that, I saw it with my own eyes. That's the most spectacular thing I've ever seen up there.
Yeah.
I was with Lee Haywood.
That's a pretty awesome incident. It's an awesome incident from a really great film, Wolflands. You can check it out on Amazon, folks. I highly recommend it. Paul Sinclair, always a pleasure to speak to you. I can't wait to hear what you're working on next. You're welcome here anytime.
Thank you, George. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks also to Dr. Kevin Knuth, my earlier guest, and my colleagues there at Premier and Coast to Coast, Michael Cosio and Donna Walker, Lex Lowe.